Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session Meeting in the Middle, Mediation in Housing with Heather Lester, who is the landlord-tenant mediator from Utah Community Action. I'm Michelle Walton. I'm going to help mediate questions later. You're all muted right now, and there's no Q&A feature, like chat feature or anything in the session. There's a raised hand feature. And that's how I'll be able to call on you for questions. We'll have a couple different times during the session allotted for questions, and Heather will let you know when those times are. But if you have questions during the session, just raise your hand, and during those times, I will call on you. So please welcome Heather. Thanks.
Hello. Yes, this is Heather Lester. I'm with Utah Community Action. Like she said, I'm a landlord-tenant mediator over here, and we do a lot of, basically mediation is centralized within the Housing and Case Management Division with Utah Community Action. So without further ado, we'll just kind of get started. This is kind of a long-winded slide, but anybody's read the description part of this session. This is basically the same thing. I just wanted to highlight obviously mediation and housing. This specifically talks about the benefits, the needs, highlighting how crucial conversations, crisis management is part of mediation, and trying to build that neutrality and that middle ground. So I guess we refer back to the title. But a little bit towards the end of the presentation, we'll also go into a tenant toolkit, which is what we normally facilitate landlord-tenant, tenant rights, tenant toolkit, through basically all the different laws in the state of Utah, just kind of like a guide stone, if you will, for tenant resources. So anyway, this just basically repeats the capstone of what this course does. Okay, so going into it, obviously I'm better with the details inside of the mediation stuff. So there's a lot of questions about mediation. It's not new, but it's changing, and a lot of times people don't understand the possibilities. So I'm kind of specifically going into what it is, the benefits of it, the purpose of it, and kind of how mediation can actually resolve itself, and how it can actually be a tool. So anyway, going forward. Okay, so what is all the fuss? There's a lot of people talking about mediation. Mediation's been around for a while. There's a lot of times people don't see mediation outside of perhaps family law, or sometimes there's a lot of mediation resources for any kind of contract dispute, personal injury perhaps. So mediation's been around. It's basically what lawyers are doing anyways. Mediators just happen to have a neutrality base to where they don't take one specific side. So the definition here, and I'm going to read it actually to you: mediation provides an opportunity for individuals to negotiate and discuss issues with the help of a neutral third party. So with a mutual agreement, they can attempt resolution between the conflicting parties. It's really important to understand that the third person in the room, sometimes people talk about it as maybe the sounding board, if you will, for situations. And it really is that, but it's more than that when it comes down to the complexities that mediation can offer. So when we talk about benefits, mediation can help to discuss concerns in hopes of coming to a mutual beneficial situation, and overall, hopefully, to avoid court involvement. When we're talking about mediation in general, we always want to facilitate communication. We always want to make sure each party, because even if they have counsel or an attorney or an advocate or whoever, we want to make sure that each side understands really the crisis at hand, the issue of what the situation is. So mediators are really good at that when it comes down to, here's this particular law, this is how we don't really apply the laws, but we explain, number one, to each side of the situation how we got here. It's pretty interesting to do this in housing. I've mediated other things outside of housing, and housing has its own shell, if you will, because housing is expedited. It's kind of confusing if nobody's been through the eviction situation before. So basically being able to have the benefit of that third person brings some basically brings everyone to the table to have a conversation. So understanding that the court involvement may or may not be inevitable if it's already happened, mediators basically can try and facilitate that through and potentially even work with the attorneys or both parties to try and get it out of the court system and come to a resolution. So some examples here: preventing small matters from becoming larger. That's really the overall process. One thing we're looking at right now, obviously, because we're in a pandemic time, I find myself actually talking a lot of times about pre-pandemic, remember the old days, and then obviously pandemic. And I hope to eventually soon get to the point where we can talk about post-pandemic. It's really changed a lot of conversations, but small matters that may or may not have been my garbage can wasn't taken out, or my faucet hasn't been fixed, or any of these smaller matters that maybe I didn't or couldn't pay my full month's rent, now have turned into, I haven't paid rent since March, or it basically just has escalated to the point where maybe pay or vacate matters turned into nuisance matters because both parties can't see eye to eye and they don't understand each other's crisis. Tenants are trying to do all they can. Landlords are trying to survive to their best ability. So really small matters are escalating into larger matters. I know you guys see that from whatever avenue or whatever way you're touching a crisis situation through your job. So just understanding that smaller matters, really, we can bring it back down and trying to understand where it started at and trying to fix from that point. Because it's not just fixing the housing matter or fixing the housing crisis, but it's actually repairing the relationship too. And I think mediators are really on the front lines of fixing relationships with folks because they don't understand really where it went south, because when you're in crisis, you don't look at the small stuff. So the next one is providing control of an outcome to both parties as opposed to a disinterested third party. So there's a lot of power in actually giving, I want to use the word, and I'm going to use air quotes because I like doing that, it makes me laugh. But there's a lot of power in giving the power to the people in the situation. I think it really gets sideways when here comes the attorneys, here comes all of the legal battles and the garnishments and just all of the stuff that comes as it goes along and escalates. But the power understanding to get in upstream, to understand how it started or where it's at the beginning part of maybe a mediation, is diffusing that and actually giving power to say, the landlord's listening to you, and to the landlord, you know, the tenant really does want to live here and is not trying to be that tenant, but let's see where we can get to. And so there's a lot of power to give both parties that I don't think is recognized enough. So then next, being creative with payment plans, move out dates, repair schedules. It's the good thing about mediation and working with counsel, with and without counsel, is because I think creative measures where maybe, you know, you have to pay by this date. There's a lot of things that I've done that have come along the lines of creativity. So it's, you know, behavior plans, perhaps. If the relationships went south, they're looking for good faith attempts. Well, you can't really put good faith in a legal agreement or a legal order. You really have to prove that kind of thing over time. So I think being creative and having the creative option as early on in the situation as possible is beneficial. And so sometimes, especially now, obviously pandemic, we're kind of limited on creative options, but it's still interesting to try and do that with all the people and all the hands that are in a lot of situations. So the next one is providing both parties with the education towards the law. I'm not a practicing attorney. When it comes down to a mediation situation, I want to, and I'm huge, if you've talked to me for more than 10 minutes, I'm huge on education as far as just understanding what your options are, what your rights, what the boundaries are for those rights. The tenant toolkit, which we'll talk about later on within this session, really goes into just the framework of the landlord-tenant laws. So I think education is important because not only do you make better decisions, you're able to advocate for resources, you're able to understand why things are happening, and that does minimize crisis and panic and just overall flailing. So education is huge, tenants, landlords as a whole. Avoiding basically mediation can help to avoid negative eviction processes with a legal binding contract. So does it mean that me as a mediator, I'm writing up a legal contract for the people that's going to govern the entire situation? It doesn't mean that. What it means is we're creatively coming to a resolution between the two parties that will go into court potentially um, as an eviction case. So if that doesn't, and it happens to work for maybe 6 months, agreements to pay, agreements to do these types of alterations with the lease, it is binding because you're acting upon an agreement, but at the same time, it gives a little bit of leverage. The law will still trump any type of legal written part of the lease, but just understanding that you had an agreement outside of that, or maybe to clarify that lease, it does help with mediation because you don't have to go and actually litigate that. So, and again, at the bottom, kind of what I've said repeatedly, it is less expensive than the legal process if there's any alternatives or any options that it can work. And it's also time saving, just getting in there, having a conversation. It is actually quite amazing how sometimes when someone like myself is able to call a landlord and have the conversation with the tenant and then bridge the gap between, it's ironic, it's fantastic. It's why I love my job. That's why I love what I do. But it is interesting to see how the communication that the tenant told me, and then me facilitating that back to the landlord, they actually hear it, or they hear it in a different way, but it's the same exact thing that was actually expressed. So there again is a lot of power in being able to have those conversations. Okay, so anyway, that's what all the fuss is about. So the next thing is kind of understanding what we can do. There's conversations, and we'll go into like conversations versus critical conversations, but it's actually participating. It's not just understanding that people have problems or understanding that everything's falling apart and the hopelessness and the different things that people are experiencing. But if you participate, and it is interesting when you actually use the word participate in conversations, because a lot of times people shut down and a lot of times people don't want to hear it, and it isn't what they want, and so they're gone. And so we can talk about that with political climate. We could talk about that within the housing crisis. We can really talk about that with anything. Crucial conversations are vital, even if you don't come out of it with your resolution or your result, you might learn something. And so just participating and bringing people to the table and engaging is important, because in mediation, you have to have both parties agreeable to move forward. So participating is huge. Crisis management, resources, knowledge is power. I repeat that ad nauseum, it seems, within this PowerPoint, but crisis management is, people can manage anything. We manage our own lives. We manage our households. We manage our finances. We manage everything. And somehow we hold it together. And then there's one thing that may fray our situation or even the clients that we serve. But managing the crisis, we just have to realize that the more knowledge we have and the more knowledge we empower with, we have more tools in the game. So the next thing I have a couple things in here that you're I'm sure going to laugh at. I hope I can break up the monotony with a couple laughs, but I think everything is figure outable. And I literally have that as my screensaver. I have that as my, anyway, most everything, if you've talked to me again for more than 5 minutes, everything is figure outable. And I'm okay with no. I think everyone has to be okay with no, but I at least want to try. And so if I ask the question, knowing that it maybe potentially could be no, I can at least say I tried to figure it out. And that goes along with not just mediation, but I mean, case management, everyone that's trying to assist with other folks or even just in their own lives. It's always figure outable and it's always worth a try. I spoke a little bit about early intervention. There's a lot of discussion. We've had many, many different presentations and conversations about early intervention, catching upstream. Because again, pre-pandemic, it was visual on how we could try to figure out what upstream really meant. It's hard now because obviously March and forward to where we're at now in October, upstream is we're paddling, right? We're paddling along the process. So does upstream look like when when the housing crisis started? Does it look like when the family or the tenants mobilized? Upstream has a lot of different faces right now, but the early intervention, the earliest intersection with the crisis is the most beneficial. The more things we can do, the more we can facilitate communication to try and find a resolution. Education, again, of course, I'm repeating, of course. Self-help, there's always, especially with court access to justice, there's a lot of resources within the court system. There's some pro bono programs out there, Utah Legal Services, People's Legal Aid, the online OCAP system through the state of Utah, basically UT courts. So there's a lot of education options to find out laws specifically, resources for folks that can help. And then obviously the tenant toolkit, which I'll highlight too, is just another resource that we've put together. So that's kind of what we can do. It's definitely not all we can do, but it's definitely what we can start doing. I love this. And so I hope this makes you laugh, because it's not, and I like to put this as this, we're not the bear in the room. Mediators are not the bear, because usually it's one person or the other, the landlord's attorneys or the tenants or the bears. But it's interesting to look at a mediator or mediation as the bear. So basically it says mediation, they wouldn't settle, so I ate them. It doesn't work like that, of course, but it's just interesting to see, well, I mean, if it doesn't work, you at least tried, but you don't have to eat them. It's just the overall. One of my favorite memes ever, though. Just wanted to share that. So continuing on with mediation, mediation itself is the practice, and neutrality is what we aspire to. Neutrality is what we go for. This is how we're viewed. This is how we're visualized as a neutral. So the bridge, and I like to look at it as a bridge for any kind of other visual, a bridge between the two parties, it's powerful, and it does help to mitigate undue conflicts. And I kind of highlighted it before when I talked about undue conflicts, because it very well could have been a smaller situation, escalated by financial reasons, escalated by personality conflicts, escalated by other occupants potentially in a residence. I don't usually see, especially in any of the mediations I either do or have been referred to, it's never just one situation. It's never just pay or vacate. It's never just a garnishment. It's never just a collection. It's never just a nuisance. There's always reasons, especially when talking to tenants, because they're more passionate about it. This is their home. This is where they have family memories with the people they love, and this is something personal to them. But again, I mean, bringing it back down, it is a renting situation. It is a contractual obligation. So when you mitigate and try to figure out where maybe it went south, it is a powerful situation to understanding, when is it time to go? When is it time to hold on to this situation? And what are your options? So the neutral presence, again, doesn't represent either party. We actively listen to both sides. We understand the interest for both sides. And then it just mends the relationship. First and foremost, if it's going to continue past mediation or evolve outside of an eviction and the contract is still going to stand, it really does benefit everyone involved to mend the relationship to some capacity. It's not like they're going to maybe have Thanksgiving dinner together as a landlord-tenant relationship. That might be weird. But just understanding where they can mutually see the efforts on both sides, that's really where it comes to maybe having a middle ground. So we assist with understanding of terms, issues, and the confusion. Again, back to the example, I've literally said the same exact thing that the tenants have said. I've been on calls where, or even in meetings where the person, the tenant, and the landlord is literally saying the same thing. I basically reiterate what they're saying, and it just comes out differently because there's no stake in the game. So some examples there is tenant to tenant. There's been a lot of those. Tenant to landlord, tenant to attorney, and then even landlord or tenant to like a service person, service agency, whether it's Utah Community Action. I mean, even folks that just do front lines, intake, diversion, anybody that maybe needs that extra person in the situation. Sometimes it benefits, sometimes it does not. Okay. So here's where it gets good. And especially with the audience too, I don't really know if anybody specifically has used mediation, or if I've worked particularly with anybody, particularly on this call. But just it's interesting with the more communication, the more conversations that I've had, not just with case managers, not just with frontline folks, not even just with other mediators that do what I'm doing. There's a difference, a huge difference between communication and crisis communication. I can have a conversation with anybody on the phone, or I can have I don't know, throw it out there, back in the old pre-pandemic days, a nice coffee meeting. Those are the days. Communication with multiple parties is pretty easy. We've done that since we were, small children. But when it comes down to crisis communication, I think that's where it kind of gets misunderstood, because a lot of times, depending on the person or depending on the person in crisis, it's really, basically it comes down to knowing, understanding, and acknowledging the difference between the two. So crisis communication, it's not about us. Like if somebody comes or calls, or I happen to be working in a mediation, or any of you happen to find someone that's in crisis, do you communicate with them the same exact way that you would maybe if you were just meeting them and ran into them at the grocery store? Absolutely not. I'm sure you guys are all shaking your head right now, because you wouldn't communicate with them the same way, even if you knew them and it was a good friend or even a random stranger. You would communicate differently with them because of the crisis. So within our work lives, we look at it's a hard balance between looking at everything as communication or looking at everything as a crisis. Because especially within pandemic right now, it really is exhausting to look at everything as a crisis or a crisis communication. Like everything's the guards up. We have to tackle it with the crisis mode. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we might as well just work and sleep, work and sleep, work and sleep. But there's got to be a balance in between, and I strive for it every single day too, because sometimes it's just like the lady in the picture. I literally put that for a reason, because sometimes you just have no other options besides just pulling your hair out. But the crisis communication that comes down to understanding where the crisis occurred. And so again, there's a reason why I put the 3 words there: knowing what the crisis is, understanding it, not for your personal benefit, but just understanding it and why they're upset about it. Because generally, I've talked to a ton of people that I literally cannot understand why they're so upset initially. And then once you actually acknowledge and say, I personally don't get it, I don't understand, but you're very passionate about why this is upsetting to you. Explain that more to me. Tell me, and then you actually start asking questions. The thing I found that helps with crisis communication is when you ask questions, instead of like saying, 'cause sometimes people reiterate, sometimes people, give a life experience that maybe helps to defuse a little bit. But if you ask questions to why is it a crisis, or why are you upset? Give me more details. It really helps them to explain, so we get it, but it also helps to de-stress and defuse us as frontline folks, because it's not about us. And there's so many times where it's hard to assume it's not about us. But going in with a mediator mentality, really understanding that this is not my crisis. This is not where I live as a person. I get it. I'm feeling exactly where you're coming from on both sides. But being able to articulate that and give them that knowledge, not just, eviction law, here's eviction law 101, but actually giving them that empowerment to really understand their crisis and how to communicate it. That's a life skill that's going to go past and beyond this situation they're in right now. So I know that's a ton of information, but this is kind of a break in between. It's literally right in the middle of the slides. Does anybody have any questions that I can answer for mediation or any kind of communication discussion?
Don't see any hands raised
Okay.
right now.
I think I talked too fast and scared them all to death. I do that.
This is the break for time to ask questions. If you have any questions for Heather right now, you can go ahead and raise your hand. there should be, Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, there should be like three buttons you can push next to your name that'll bring up a place for you to be able to raise your hand. I think I explained that correctly.
Well, as long as we're not talking to ourselves,
Okay.
right? I guess that's the win.
It looks like we do have a couple questions. So,
okay.
Lee Wild, I'm going to go ahead and allow. Okay, so I just unmuted you, Callie, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. I was just wondering, I love that you're talking about with the mediation, and I think it's really important to remember it's not about us, it's about the crisis. I'm just wondering if you have any mediation techniques in helping calm the storm and calm the chaos, or if that's something you're going to talk about a little later.
No, that's a fantastic question, because I think it depends, and I know that nobody wants to hear like, well, it depends. The main what might work for me doesn't work for other folks, because you kind of have to channel your inner person, right? Because I think one conflict, one crisis situation with a tenant doesn't work for the next tenant that could walk through the door, right? Or the next landlord for that matter that could walk through the door. So I think the best tactics or tools to kind of take away from that is figuring out, how do you resolve in your life, right? I'm a mom, I'm a renter myself, so and I have some of the same battles, but some people may not, right? So how I handle personal circumstances and how I've worked through mediation training for that is just understanding the conflict. And I think active listening, obviously, knowingly engaging in the conversation, is really a place to start. It's hard though, right? Because it's a slippery slope. If I say to a tenant, oh man, I've been there, I've had a crappy landlord, this is what I did. Because the problem with that, as an advocate or as a case manager, if you resonate with that situation and you're trying to diffuse it as a technique, it's slippery, because if they say, oh, well, they've done it and this is what they did, and this is probably going to work for me, and they rely on you. So I think it's dangerous too, because you have to advocate and be present, but at the same time dial back, because anything you say to someone that's in crisis becomes authority. And it's dangerous, again, because not even so much being legally tied as a mediator, but just as an advocate. If I said, well, I did this and my landlord did that, so I served him with these papers, and then I went over here and hired this attorney. If they rely on you for that and it doesn't work, number one, you've shot the communication down. They may be in a worse situation. So, not to go glass half empty on your question, but I think it really resides to where your comfort zone is, because your comfort zone and how you resolve, say you as an individual, Callie asked the question, if you had to resolve a problem, how would you do it? And how would you, say it was your child or something, how would you advocate for them to do it? If you have to call and make arrangements on a electrical bill, there's a way how you do it, and then there's a way how other people do it. But if you're comfortable with your comfort zone, you can help them and empower rather than telling them what to do. I hope that helped. Did that answer your question to a long degree?
No, I think I think that helps a lot. I think remembering it's case by case is important, but I do think that that's a lot of good advice. Thank you.
Cool. And just to trail on that just a smidge, because our comfort zone, even in working, and I've worked in big groups of mediators, and they're all throwing out ideas, and it's just this fest of stuff, and everyone does it differently, and it's difficult to do it someone else's way. But I think when you're the most successful and you love your job, it's easy to come to work and actually mitigate crisis, because you're able to do it confidently with how you resolve. So anyway, that's just a tip. Whether it works for everyone, I don't know.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and then we have one other question from Robbie Martin. Robbie, I'm going to unmute you right now so you can ask your question. So you can go ahead.
Hi. I really am enjoying this presentation, for one thing. My question is really basic. I just wanted to know if your slides were available, because I need the one with the bear and the picnic table. I need that one.
Nice. Yes, absolutely. I assume they are. I mean, Michelle can, I don't know how they're dispersing them, but I'm more than happy to, my email address is at the end on the last slide, so I'm more than happy to email it if you want it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, is there any other questions or should I keep going or?
Those were the only two questions that have popped up so far. So
Awesome.
we're
Okay,
good.
so we'll go into the back end real fast. I definitely don't want to be the person that goes all the way into somebody's lunch because that could create, again, the crisis, and we're going to mitigate that. Little pun there. I'm sure everybody appreciates it. Second part. So aside with mediation, a lot of the time where you're not really in the thicks and the throes of an active mediation or a conversation back and forth, again, one of the things I'm super passionate about, Utah Housing Coalition puts this toolkit together. I had the opportunity to help revise this last edition that we did in January with them. So this is available on their website. I did put the link there. Not that that does you too much good because you can't really click on it now, but just knowing if you go to Utah Housing Coalition's website under resources, it's there in Spanish and also in English. So the reason I use this and the reason I refer to it is because I use it for like tenant trainings, agency trainings, pretty much any kind of option to where I can go talk about mediation, or I can talk about eviction law, or I can talk about mediation in eviction law, trying to help advocate to empower tenants. And even landlords have requested the tenant toolkit because they want to kind of see how it's thrown, put together, and how it can help them be better landlords. So that's pretty much this is what it looks like. I just gave you that picture so you know you were in the right place when you go there. I did snip the table of contents. Obviously it's 30 something pages, right? But these are the main contents of it. And there's 3 specific sections. So it's being a successful tenant, tenant rights, and then resources. And the resources, as you probably all well know, that resources change all the time. Again, pandemic, pre-pandemic, sometimes it held longer in the kettle, if you will, pre-pandemic, because it took a lot of time to change things. It seems that with pandemic and the different things that are happening with housing resources and different avenues, different options, different agencies doing different things, some of the resources do flex a bit, but the main foundation to where you can get those answers, like 211, obviously Utah Community Action, the Homeless Resource Center line, pretty much, and housing authorities too. I could just go on for days, but just understanding that those places are still there within this resource guide, but just the different things that you may call about, or you may resource out with different agencies about, may have altered a smidge. So again, those are the 3 sections. The reason why, let me go back actually. So the reason why I gave the table of contents here, because it talks more in detail. I wish I can't make that bigger. I'm blind. I want to scare you with my face right up there. It breaks it down specifically because successful tenant is kind of the same things I was talking about with mediation. So understanding communication, giving tips on how to read your lease, what to look for in your lease, tenant safety, understanding like do's and don'ts, really going into like the business relationship. A lot of times when I'm teaching my classes, I have tenants that are, they're looking for the information and they don't understand, or I think it's hard when you're in crisis, let alone when you're not, right? So people are saying, well, how can you evict me in 3 days? Or why does the law say that? And so understanding the lease that they sign, it's not like you can just go buy a car and then if you don't like the car, or if the car stops working, then you just basically abandon the car. That just generally doesn't happen because it's a contractual obligation. So short of educating on contract law, it's just educating on, this is a contract, this is what you signed, make sure you read, review, and understand whether it's 5 pages or 45 pages, because we've seen some leases that are quite long, understanding that everything that's in that agreement that you signed is what you agree to or attest to, and then how to build that relationship around whatever you may be working through, because it's at least 6 months, it's at least a year, sometimes 2 years depending on the lease. So going into it knowledgeable, understanding what your options are, and then if things do go south, or if you do have an issue, what is the proper way to handle those types of situations. So anyway, within the toolkit, we do discuss that for half of the class on how to be a successful tenant. And then of course, tenant rights, where the legal process comes in, understanding the types of eviction notices, fair housing issues, different kind of laws that go in, to assist tenants in the instance that there's a problem. And then of course, the eviction process, understanding the order, the order of the way things happen, which notices, when it goes to court, what that looks like, and how to kind of navigate through the process. Okay. So obviously being successful, and everybody loves the golden rule. Every time I put this on a slide, they're like, ah, I've heard that since I was like 3. So the golden rule, obviously, you treat others how you want to be treated. That's great. And I think it's helpful, and everybody wants to have that type of situation. But even when you're doing the best that you can and you're treating people the best way that you would want to be treated, and it's not reciprocated, we go back and we trigger back into crisis, right? They're not doing this, so I'm not going to do that. And it really, in order to keep it so it doesn't, completely retrovert back, as a mediator, don't trust me, I don't go in and say, let's be nice to each other, let's all be kind, let's work through this, let's maybe make some cookies and exchange recipes. No, that'd be great. And if one of them ever goes that direction, I will make sure that I publicly blast that out, that something happened like that, especially now. But it is interesting to see when landlords do come to the table and they take out so much of the business. They don't take out the business relationship, but they take out the business need, and they understand, especially now. I've seen some good things happen within pandemic times, because they're not getting their money either. It's not just because the tenant doesn't want to pay, or they just think they deserve to live there for free, because sometimes landlords say that, but they're actually taking and saying, I do have a business relationship. I know you live here. I really don't want you to leave, but I do need my rent. I do need to help to pay my bills on the back end. And so that kindness that I've referenced specifically on this slide is kindness yet understanding. And so if we can paint the picture to where both sides understand, whether it be, landlord needs to pay their bills, family of 4, kids at school, remote learning, parents are trying to work, odd jobs, temporary agencies, really painting the picture to say, I'm not being a crappy tenant, or, maybe I could do this in lieu of, being able to pay the late fee. I mean, is it negotiable? Is everything figure outable to some degree? So that's the golden rule I talk about, not specifically like, I treated you nice, so you need to be nice to me. I just wanted to explain that, because sometimes people are like, oh, she's out there. So being informed and being knowledgeable, it goes back to the education part. But because tenant rights exist, a lot of times people assume they don't, whether there's not enough of them, whether they're completely, whether they don't understand the tenant rights, or the fact that they don't know how to utilize them. But there are tenant rights out there. Eviction laws are very confusing, and they're extremely expedited, and can be detrimental if they're ignored or avoided. A lot of times, especially with collection law, for example, if I owed a medical bill and it was 2 years ago, there's likelihood that, yeah, I'm gonna have to go to court for it. They're gonna try to, get a judgment against me. They're going to try and maybe even garnish. But a lot of times that takes a while. And so in the instance that you have a housing crisis, though, and I'm definitely talking to everyone knows this. It's not like I'm saying anything brand new. But if I'm looking at a housing crisis, whether they're presenting, with an eviction notice, whether they've been locked out, whether they're now going through the collection process of it and potentially getting garnished, it's expedited. And it's detrimental because there's so many things that go into a judgment. With housing, if you happen to not move or you can't move, there's other fees and costs that come into this judgment that aren't part of the actual contract at first. I'm basically speaking to like treble damages, and we can go into a whole bunch of that. That's a way longer conversation than this. But just understanding the detriment, though, if you don't act upon it, or if you don't acknowledge it, it's still happening. And then sometimes people do call and they say, hey, I knew that there was some papers and I got served some stuff. I wasn't right sure what I should do, so I just didn't do anything. And then now I just, 2 minutes ago, the sheriff came over, the constable came over and locked me out. And it happens. I mean, yesterday, I believe, no, it was actually Tuesday, there was probably 14 different lockouts that we're trying to mitigate through to see what options they had to see if they possibly can work through a lockout. And so it's still happening, and all of these things are still going on, not to the same caliber that they could, but just understanding that the detriment can be there. So we have to empower people to, number one, understand, and number two, to act. Knowledge is power. I don't care if it's just housing. I don't care if it's eviction. I don't care if it's even healthcare, right? Healthcare is housing, however capacity you want to look at it. If you know, or if you don't know, find a way to figure out what you can for your situation. So knowledge really does empower people. And even if we can't fix their situation, we can still empower them to know what to do or where to go in the instance of. And then, of course, resources are priceless. I'm definitely with Utah Community Action. You've seen that from the beginning of the slide. But, there's so many different programs, even just our agency, let alone the other CAP agencies throughout the state. There's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of places. I mean, 211 is a fantastic place for resources. A fantastic place for resources, just to find options, whether it's food, internet, education options, utilities. There's so many things that goes into each crisis. Again, it's never just one thing. So being successful, that's some of the key options to try and help people. And here we go with this one. I put this in red on purpose because I wanted to scare you right before lunch. But again, with everything's figure outable, this is, I'm probably going to get a tattoo that looks just like this, even with the arrows. I don't know. That's obviously extreme, but communication, documentation, and cooperation. It really is that simple. Any situation you look at, it really can be calculated through these steps. Even if you're not in crisis and you're communicating throughout your lease when you sign it, there's documentation for your lease when you sign it, and then to be a successful tenant, you're cooperating within the lease parameters of what you signed. And then if things happen to go to the other side of a housing crisis, and even now, let's talk pandemic. If there's a crisis and communicating that, I mean, initially we know the steps that have happened, and give or take if I miss a few, but there's initially what happened in March, and then there was a governor's moratorium, and then from that there was a federal moratorium, and then from that there was the CARES Act, and then the 30 days option from that, and now there's the CDC declaration. And so there's all these different things, and there may be more, and I very well could have missed a couple of different options, or I did miss one. There was the addendum that helped folks to kind of push back or make some payment arrangements on the rent initially when the pandemic started. So any of those things, though, anything I mentioned really does result around the top two, right? You have communication. I have an issue. I've been laid off, or I'm sick, or whatever. My children are home now, and whatever the situation was or is, you've communicated it. And then any kind of communication, encourage people to document it. If I normally talk with my landlord through text, I'm screenshotting everything. If I wanted to talk to them in person, I'm following it up with a text, or I'm following it up with an email saying, hey, we just talked out there in the courtyard or whatever, and this is what we talked about. I just wanted to make sure that this is my understanding, and I'm documenting that. So it goes a long way. I mean, even within the court exposures that I have, and you could talk to any of the legal services that I mentioned. I mean, documentation helps everything to be more streamlined, to understand points of view. And then the most frustrating part, but yet the most rewarding part, is the cooperation. So in a successful landlord-tenant relationship, cooperation is great. I mean, we fulfill our lease, we're giving notice, we're doing the things we need to do. It would be swell if everything actually worked out like that. And some do, and that's great. But in the instance, the reason why we're here and we're so passionate about our jobs is because cooperation sometimes doesn't occur, or communication doesn't occur from the beginning of this step-by-step, right? So communication has to follow up with cooperation has to follow up with the communication you're agreeing to, putting forth, having in general. There's a lot of situations where we've done all of these things and there's a mediation agreement in place or a mediation understanding or documents perhaps showing some sort of a plan, and the cooperation from either side doesn't occur. So does that mean mediation failed, or does it mean what? I mean, it's frustrating because you put all of this time in to trying to facilitate this, but the cooperation doesn't work. It goes back to why the initial issue may have happened in the beginning. There's a reason why this altered plan or mediation didn't survive. Maybe the communication wasn't clear. You have to really dissect why that happened. But cooperation is really what drives home any kind of resolution plan, especially in crisis communication. So anyway, I could obviously talk for another 30 minutes about that, but I won't bore you to tears. But it really is those 3 steps, even when you're talking with some of your clients or your tenants or whoever, and just understanding, like if we've done this, we can't jump from communication to cooperation, or we can't go and expect cooperation without communicating the needs. It really does work in this particular order. Within the toolkit, I mean, obviously it goes into way more detail than I will here, but obviously right to fair housing discrimination occurs. There's definitely better authorities than mediation for that. We see a lot of it, and it exists. As far as the people and the resources and the agencies to go to for these types of assistance is definitely in the toolkit, but just understanding that there is a right to fair housing. Also the same thing with Utah Fit Premise Act. Obviously we named them here as far as right for habitable conditions and then right for peaceful enjoyment. It does explain that in more detail. It's specifically through the Utah Code, but it is something that needs to be discussed with legal counsel. It does need to be understood that this does fit the situation. As mediation, we'd never advise on this is something you should do. Sometimes there's questions asked about what do you think I should do? And of course we can't obviously give that information, but if they've already went through the process and they've determined through themselves or counsel that this is what they're doing to resolve their situation, mediation does come to the table and explain and try to facilitate communication with both sides, whether there's attorneys involved or not. So I mentioned earlier as well, Utah Court Self-Help Center, the OCAP, it's right there on their website. Anything self-help, it's not just housing, tons and tons of areas of law that they have self-help resources for. So definitely check that out or refer folks to that for some knowledge. Utah Legal Services, Utah State Bar, they have an Access to Justice division. And then People's Legal Aid is a new nonprofit that's helping through debt collection and evictions right now. So all of those are definitely on, on the web. Utah Housing Coalition, where you found the toolkit in general, they also have links to these resources too. Okay, so I mean, this kind of takes us to the end, and I know that I'm doing pretty good on time. I haven't even rambled too fast. Just to kind of end it though, we went over a bunch of different things. There's definitely stories out there. We could probably share stories back and forth with a lot of people that are on the call. But these are the things that I see all the time. And when people are calling for resources, it's not just because they want to mediate their situation. It's not like they're calling just like 211 would say, where do I go or what do I do? But these are the conversation questions when I'm trying to communicate with people that call and are interested in trying to help or figure out resolutions, right? So they always want help. I mean, where do I start? How do I qualify? Am I protected? What are my options? How can anyone move in 3 days? That's my favorite. No, I'm just kidding. My favorite is during a pandemic, really. And I have an eviction filed against me, now what? This is definitely just the upper crust on top of the huge pie that we're talking about as far as a crisis or a conflict. But you guys hear these all the time, and this is definitely not news. You could probably add to this in a better fashion than I can. But it's just really understanding how to navigate. There's definitely other sessions that talk about how to navigate through, what to do in this period of time, how to line up the needs that the people in need right now. But just understanding where to go. And so I think the toolkit is a really good resource for that. And then obviously the city and county government pages are really fantastic. Workforce services, obviously, they always refer back and forth. So we're all kind of in tandem together. That's pretty much the last slide. And I know that maybe there's some questions. even if mediation doesn't resolve, or me as a mediator can't resolve and interact with whatever you may need, I definitely try to at least be a good resource. And so if I can do anything to help or to kind of explain any part of this that you may want more information on, my information is right here. Please feel free to reach out. And then if anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to take some more.
Okay, so yeah, if you'll just use the raise your hand function if you have any other questions for Heather, and then I'll be able to unmute you so you can ask your question. Now is the time.
I didn't even take it right to 12:40. Look at me, and people are they're not going to be torn into their lunch. I say that's a win. And I don't know, when Callie asked before, as far as the slides, are they putting them all together for everybody's presentations or anything?
I'm
I don't
not
know.
sure about necessarily the slide decks, but all of the sessions are being recorded,
Oh, okay.
and will be going up on I think the GWS website, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, if you find out that
all the recordings will be on housing.utah.gov.
Oh, nice. Swell. I'm going to write that down. Okay. Well, if nobody has any questions, then I can kind of conclude, and hopefully it was helpful. And thank you guys for attending this session, and let me know if I can do anything to help anybody or assist.
Don't see any questions. Nobody's raising their hand, so.
Nobody. I scared them all to death. It was the bear. I know it was the bear. But we're going to keep it, though. We're going to keep the bear. We're not going to eat it. So, but anyway, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to be here, and I definitely love what I do. So if I can assist, never feel that you can't reach out. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Heather.
Thanks.